Hi, Markus. How are you?
Hello, Heiko. I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm fine too. Hello to everyone who's tuning in to today's Ask Me Anything session
Hello.
with Bruce Payette. So I think that will be a very interesting conversation about the past, the present, and the future. And as we always try to have a little theme at the beginning, like in the on this day, we have today we have a musical theme, and it's because Phil Taylor, not the darts player, but the drummer from Motorhead, would have had his birthday if he would have still with us.
Former drummer.
Former drummer, because he's drumming in heaven, probably.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. pretty maybe, yeah.
Or a little bit more south.
Yeah, where it's hot. Yeah. And I think they called them the filthy animal. Yeah. And I think I read somewhere that he was kind of the inspiration for the crazy drummer at the Muppets show, who was always doing this crazy stuff. Anyway, so that's that. So I will remove also the background now. So we talked about our theme of the day, so to speak. And now I would say, without further ado, let's get Bruce into the show. It's really great. Hi, Bruce.
Hello. How are you guys doing?
Doing very well.
Fine. Thank
It's
you.
great to have you with us today in our Ask Me Anything session. We met in Prague a few weeks ago at the PSConf, and and I think I wrote to you a while ago on LinkedIn, because we spent dinner together with you and your wife, and I kind of totally forgot to ask questions about how was the time with the PowerShell team when you started developing it, and your reply was ask away, I think. and then yeah, I thought maybe it would be good to make it a little conversation that people can join. So for everyone who is live here in the stream, either on YouTube or on LinkedIn, if you have questions, please let us know. Would be great if we get some interaction here. So as I said, if you have any questions, please feel free. And so as usual, Markus, right? So we are starting with a little background, like where we're coming from, and there's the first question. Do you wanna take it, Markus?
Yeah, sure. So how did you end up working for the Microsoft PowerShell team?
It was actually kind of interesting because I'm Canadian, so I was working for a company in Kitchener-Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. But I had been working at a company called Softway Systems, who did the Interix subsystem for Windows, and they were acquired by Microsoft. And then a little while later, they asked me to join them. So yeah, it was sort of acqui-hired.
Okay. Interesting. So what time frame was that? What
2001.
2001. Okay. Wow. That's okay.
So I was actually hired to work on the services for Unix project, but I was only on that project for about 6 hours.
For 6 hours?
For about 6 hours. And then they told me about this new shell project that was starting up. And I thought, well, that'd be an awesome thing to do. So I joined the Kermit team, because that was the name at the time.
Yeah.
Kermit.
Wow. So from the get-go, you already were involved in what would became PowerShell.
Yes, I was on the PowerShell team before Jeffrey was.
Okay. Wow. I didn't know that. That's cool. Very cool. So I think that already brings us to the second question. what were some of the most significant technical challenges during the development of PowerShell, and how were they overcome?
Streaming was a problem. In a normal shell that has a bunch of processes connected together by pipes, you just get sort of natural concurrency. Because we were all running in process, we didn't get that for free. And somebody had proposed doing one thread per commandlet, but that would have really consumed a lot of resources. So we had to come up with a way to do the streaming processing. So every object goes through the whole pipeline at one time. And that became the begin process and end blocks in a commandlet. So that as each commandlet calls process record to emit an object, then the next commandlet in the chain, their process record gets called, and so on throughout the rest of the chain.
Okay, and so that was a decision that have been made very early when you.
Yeah, pretty early when we were just kind of, because Jeffrey had prototyped PowerShell, but it just had the basic like parameter binding and so forth. And every commandlet ran to completion before passing anything on to the next command. And if you had a long running command, then you would wait for a long time to get any results back. We want to get the results back as soon as possible.
Okay.
So we ended up writing the pipeline processor basically.
Okay, I mean, which is a core part of everything around, right?
Yeah, it's essentially when we were designing PowerShell, there were two views of PowerShell. One was as a scripting language, but the other one was as an engine. So you can invoke PowerShell commandlets from any .NET language by using the PowerShell.create.addCommand mechanism. So that was intended to be independent from the language. And so if people wanted to switch out the default language, the default PowerShell language, and use something that was maybe more like Python, then they'd be able to do that and access the pipeline processor directly rather than having to go through the language to get at the pipeline processor.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so just looking at the third question that we have, Markus, which is kind of a little bit related, right, to the...
Yeah, sure. Yeah, can you share a specific instance where you had to make a difficult design decision while creating PowerShell? What factors influenced your decision?
Actually, one of the interesting biggest decisions was how to handle quoting in strings. In normal strings, you use backslash, but because Windows uses backslash as a file separator, it would be very annoying to have to double quote every path that you type in. And so Jim Truer came up with the idea of using the backtick because it's kind of like a slash. And so unlike all other shells on the planet, PowerShell uses the backtick to do a character escape. And lots of people have complained about that because it makes it very hard to see. The character is so small, especially if you're quoting at the end of a line where you want the command to continue on the next line. It's hard to see that little quote, but it has pros and its cons. It made everybody's lives easier for the most part, but harder in more isolated cases.
Yeah, but it became a common thing, right? I mean, people are using it, and then just Joseph, who had actually did a session about PowerCLI yesterday in our PowerShell user group. It just came in, obviously. So you made it from the airport in Boston. That's good, Joseph. So thanks for the comment. Yeah, because he was talking about the pipeline. So yeah, very cool. So I think we could sneak in one question we got from our audience. I won't name Doug, but it was obviously him who sent us a question, which kind of relates to maybe the more like the structure of how when PowerShell was developed. Like, could you share some insights on navigating the organizational landscape at Microsoft to bring PowerShell from concept to reality?
Yeah, there's an XKCD cartoon that shows different organizational structures at different high-tech companies. And the one for Microsoft is a bunch of triangles all pointing guns at each other.
I saw that, where they all have the...
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And that was actually startlingly accurate. There was a lot of co-opetition going on between groups because they were fighting for resources and so on and so forth. And that's where Jeffrey spent a lot of his time, was navigating. I think at one point he fired his entire management chain, which is interesting. His manager, his manager's manager, and the manager's manager's manager.
Well, I think you mentioned it when we were at the dinner table, actually. Yeah. So I mean, that's
that's pretty tricky.
That's wow. Okay. Okay. So, but it looks like, to get things done. Okay. There was.
Yeah. And another interesting one was so PowerShell XP had just shipped before we started PowerShell. So it was the first real consumer OS from Microsoft, not like something sitting on top of MS-DOS. And it was much better for the end user because it didn't crash anymore. You had a badly behaved program, it wouldn't take down your box. What it did instead is it hung. So you would have, like, especially in IE, it would, if you were in IE and you're doing something, you just get a hung process, and then you have to kill the process. And most of those hangs came from the plugins. So this was a big, there was a big requirement that nobody could have a plugin architecture. You couldn't be plugging stuff into programs without the high level approval. And of course, PowerShell lives for plugins with modules. So we actually had a plan where you wouldn't have plugins, you'd have a million different little PowerShells. So you'd have a PowerShell for Exchange and a PowerShell for SQL, and you had to go from process to process to do anything. And there's actually still some vestiges of that in PowerShell. There's a feature in PowerShell, in PowerShell.exe, there's a -encoded command parameter, which all the security guys really hate. I get yelled at a lot for this parameter. But what it does is it allows, you can be in a PowerShell session and then call PowerShell again, passing a script block. And PowerShell will recognize that, encode the script block base 64, and then use the -encoded command parameter so that the text of the script gets passed to the child process. And it's worked pretty well. It was going to be the way things would work. You would have done, you'd be in PowerShell core and you'd call PowerShell SQL, passing in a block of code. But then eventually we got dispensation from the architecture, the high lords of architecture, to have a limited plugin architecture, which were snap-ins, modeled after the MMC snap-in idea, where you had to register them and a whole bunch of other stuff. And PowerShell 1.0 shipped with that. It was not a great experience. So in PowerShell 2, we introduced modules, which is much more flexible. But if you look in the source code, there's still stuff in the source code called single shell. That was from when we moved away from the what we called mini shell. So there'd be a mini shell for PowerShell and mini shell for SQL, all that kind of thing, to one shell that had plugins. So it was very interesting.
Okay.
Interesting time at Microsoft.
Yeah. So it looks like a lot of things had to be considered to get it off the ground, right?
Yep.
So we have Alexander with us. Hi, Alexander, and he has a question as well here. Why did PowerShell team pick array as a default type for collection instead of array list or any other generic collection types?
Well, when we started, so with regards to generics, when we started PowerShell, we were using version 1 of the CLR, which didn't have generics. The version 2 of the CLR came out just a little while before we shipped. So we made a bunch of changes at that point to use generic collections instead of non-generic collections. But we didn't change array because that would have required enormous changes. We went with array because it was the simplest collection type. So the model was something like Perl or Python that have relatively simple collections. And we went with that. But because you can't resize an array, it causes certain performance problems. It has one sort of valuable side effect in that if you add an element to an array, you get a new array. So if you have a variable pointing at 1, 2, 3, and then you add another element to that and store it in a new variable, the new variable will have 1, 2, 3, 4, but the old variable will still have 1, 2, 3. So you didn't get these side effects happening. But in retrospect, in terms of performance, yeah, we would have been better going with one of the more expandable data types. But we chose hash table because it was the simplest dictionary type. We chose array because it was the simplest collection type. And those are the ones that have special syntax associated with them. So we wanted to, because we're targeting IT pros who wouldn't necessarily be programmers, we didn't want to introduce complicated collection types to that audience. But
okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we have another comment. It's from Andreas. Hi, Andreas. So he looks like he's working with PowerShell quite a long time, and he was.
Yes.
So he was.
Same here.
yeah. Okay, but that's. And I think wasn't it also Citrix that went for the snap-ins technology at the beginning when they built their and still I think it's still the case. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I saw something in this direction. Yeah. Okay. So, but the things obviously evolved over time,
Mm-hmm.
which is great. Which I think brings us to the next question. I think we at question number 4 in the Markus. I think so.
Yeah, it was question number 4. Are there any interesting or unexpected ways you've seen PowerShell being used in the years since its release?
The number of people who use it to write GUI applications, WinForms applications, is kind of startling. That was a feature that we almost didn't ship. It was near the end of development cycle. I discovered that with a very small change to PowerShell, you could start using .NET classes, like graphical classes, so you could write these UIs. And it was only like a 2 or 3 line change. And we took it to management, and management said, no, you can't do that. And the rationale was, well, it'll let people write these GUI programs, and we can't test all those GUI programs. It's like, that's not our code. That's the customer's code. You know, we shouldn't disallow them from doing things in PowerShell. We want to enable them to be as creative as possible. So in the end, with lots of pushing, we were able to check in that little change, and it made graphical stuff possible.
Cool. All right. So, okay, are we at question number 5 now? We are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I think that's also an interesting one. How did the team balance the goal of making PowerShell accessible for beginners while also making it powerful enough for advanced users? Was this part of the discussion?
It was absolutely part of it. I mean, there were a bunch of audiences that we're targeting. We were targeting people who were non-programmers and would probably never use more than a one-line PowerShell script. I used to joke that the average length of a PowerShell script is one line. So, and then we wanted, because we were on top of .NET, we had a lot of richness in the APIs and the data types and so on. So we wanted to be at least, well, Perl was one of our models, if anybody remembers Perl. And so we wanted to be at least equivalent to what Perl could do. And at one point, the syntax was going to be like Perl as well. And then we decided, well, we want to make the Microsoft developer community happier, then we should align with C#, which was the new language at the time. So the syntax for all the control statements and things like that are all based on the C# syntax. The for each statement and if statements and so on are all basically C#. You can. I always thought it would be possible to take a C# program and mechanically translate it into PowerShell, which some people did. I thought that was interesting, is that people were taking existing C# stuff and rewriting it in PowerShell. And I'm not really sure why.
I was just wondering if, like performance-wise and stuff, probably it was not really faster, but maybe it was just out of interest, probably.
Yeah, it might have been simpler because we have, like, you don't have to go through all these abstractions to get at files, for example. You just do get content and it gives you the content of a file. So shells have larger building blocks of functionality than most programming languages. And shells also make it much easier to access processes. So if you want to run a process and get like ipconfig or something like that, and get the output into the shell session, in Python you have to call popen and do a bunch of other stuff before you can get that information. In PowerShell you just say ipconf.exe and save it in a variable. So it makes external executables part of the command set of the environment.
All right. Oh, we have a comment from Matt here, who obviously was building phones and had fun with it. So, and he also has a question. Maybe we can also put that in right here.
I definitely agree with him that it's fun, and it was fun building little GUIs with PowerShell without having to fire up Visual Studio and all that junk.
Yeah. And I heard now, many years later, there are even other solutions that do that automatically with scripts, but that's a different story. So is Pester considered the de facto testing framework for the platform? If so, is there a plan to incorporate it?
It is. It is the official blessed testing framework. When we were doing the port to Linux, we needed to bring across all of the tests, which were depending on a Windows test framework. So we decided, what we'll do is we'll do it in script, because scripts will test the engine pretty well. And they were pretty portable, so you can run them on Linux or whatever. So that was our idea, and we considered writing our own. I mean, people had been writing little test frameworks for PowerShell for years. There were like 3 of them in our group. So we decided that Pester had the right set of features. It was actively supported, and it was becoming the de facto standard in the community. So we thought that it would make more sense for us to adopt Pester and run with that rather than coming up with some Microsoft specific framework. Shipping is weird. We're continually trying to ship less stuff because it takes up a lot of space on your disk and it takes a long time to install. So being able to get Pester it only takes one command to install Pester, install module. So it's not a big burden. It means that Pester isn't on every machine. Every machine that has PowerShell would end up with Pester. And there's a lot of scenarios where you don't want to have the framework because you're just using it as a runtime. So I don't know if there's you have to ask Steve Lee if there's any plan to incorporate it into the binaries. But really, it doesn't have a cadence that ships with the shell. That's one of the things that's different about PowerShell, PowerShell Core or PowerShell 7. the Windows PowerShell shipped with Windows. It was a component of Windows, and it still ships with PowerShell with Windows. But .NET, PowerShell Core ships on a .NET cadence, not a Windows cadence, and that's why it's not in the box on Windows, because the cadence is different.
Yeah, which is an ongoing topic for many organizations, right? When they think about switching.
Having it there by default was really, really important for people to take advantage of it, and now we're back into that situation where it isn't there by default, but at least it's relatively easy to install.
Yeah, that's true. So we have 2 more questions that came in from Alexander. So he's asking away. Do you think the PowerShell drives didn't get all deserved love and are kind of underused, unfortunately?
Yeah, and I would say that that's true. We were very excited about this idea of having a uniform hierarchical stores for all sorts of things. Like Active Directory was one of the ones that you would be able to CD into your Active Directory. But I don't think that ever got shipped. An Active Directory provider, we shipped the function provider and the variable provider, obviously the file system provider, but we didn't. I don't think there were any providers added after the first bunch were shipped. I'm trying to remember. But yeah, there are things that would have been. Anything with a hierarchy would be better, maybe exposed through the provider, the drives. It was very similar to what Linux did with /proc, or actually it was Plan 9, I guess it did it originally. In systems with /proc, then dir, like doing an ls on /proc gives you a list of all the processes, and then. So you don't need a special API to get processes. You just do a dir on that directory, and it gives you all the processes. Internal elements of the operating system are exposed through the file store. We really like that model and essentially tried to adapt it for PowerShell. But yes, they didn't get as much love as we might have liked. They're also kind of complicated. I mean, they were. It's a bit of a barrier writing a new provider because there's a lot of interfaces that you have to support. So I think we could have, if we'd done a slightly simpler model, then it wouldn't have been such a barrier to people writing them. Yeah. Yes, Azure Drive. I'd forgotten about Azure Drive.
Yeah, so Alexander just wrote, that's true. Yeah, you can navigate through, which is interesting, right? Navigating through all the resources. And Alexander has another question. Let's sneak that in here as well. What do you think is the hardest PowerShell concept to explain to a new user?
Maybe the difference between for each object and the for each statement. Though people don't actually have a problem with that, people just sort of naturally use it, even though it's for each object is a higher order function that takes a function as its argument, which is a fairly sophisticated concept in computer science. And trying to explain it to people how it works can be confusing because it has a lot of lambda expressions and a lot of terminology that is not used outside of computer science. But it worked really well in PowerShell because you just showed people how to use it and they just used it. They didn't get hung up on the idea of lambda notation and that kind of thing.
Okay, so we are back to the list of questions. It's my turn, Markus. Mm-hmm. My turn. Your turn.
It's your it's your turn. Okay. No, we are at question. Sorry, we are at question 6. So it's my turn.
Oh yes. Okay.
Yes. So can you describe any specific instances where user feedback greatly influenced the development or direction of PowerShell?
So when we were developing it, we were partnered with the Exchange team, and in fact, at one point, if we didn't look like we might not ship in Windows, but we would have shipped with Exchange as a feature of Exchange rather than a feature of Windows. But they were very interested in getting a way to automate configuring Exchange. And they had a lot of beta customers that they were feeding PowerShell to. So we got a lot of feedback from the Exchange beta customers as well as from the outside. I'm trying to think of like switch parameters were one. So originally we just had Boolean parameters, and it was kind of weird because sometimes you want to pass a Boolean to or pass a value to a Boolean parameter, and sometimes you don't. And simply having them be present or absent confused the issue. And so we invented switch parameters that are present or absent, and can take an argument if you want using the colon, trailing colon, but they're very rarely you pass explicit arguments into a Boolean or into a switch parameter. The fact that you can is one of the things that enables command calling commands. So the proxy commands that we generate for remoting, for example, have to wrap switch parameters, and they have to take the value of the parameter that was passed to them and subsequently pass it on to the wrapped command. And so switch parameters taking an argument is really useful in that scenario, but most of the time, if you find that you're passing a Boolean parameter, a Boolean value, an explicit value to a switch parameter, you're probably doing something wrong.
All right. So we have another question here from Andreas. What is your opinion about installing PowerShell 7 enterprise-wide and making it the default shell local and for peers remoting?
Yes, as long as you're on one of the long LTS branches, I think it's pretty good. PowerShell core depends on what you're installing it on as well. If you're using Linux machines, for example, or Macs, then PS7 you have to use that. If you're in a pure Windows environment, you can use PS7 as long as it does everything you need it to do. There are some things that you can't do in PowerShell 7 that you can do with Windows PowerShell, because Windows PowerShell is based on the system .NET rather than an installed .NET. So some things like WMI access and a number of other things aren't supported in PowerShell core because .NET Core doesn't support them. So I think it's something that I would do. I think I would standardize on an LTS and deploy it enterprise-wide, and that gives you common remoting for everything.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, we see in our when we talk to companies that the adoption of PowerShell 7 is definitely growing. So we do this monthly webinars, and every couple of months we ask these questions: what are you using? Windows PowerShell, PowerShell 7, or both? And compared to like 3 years ago, I would say step by step organizations at least use it in parallel. But I think still many have some issues with the deployment process, and compared to having it in the system, in the OS right away.
Yeah, in container-based environments, you can just add it to your container image and just deploy that. So that makes it that takes care of some of the problems with deployment. Yeah. But having it just be there is certainly preferable.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So question number 7. If you could go back in time to the early stages of PowerShell development, is there anything you would do differently?
Well, probably use an expandable data type for arrays instead of using the array type. And use ordered dictionaries, I think, by default, rather than right now you have to cast a dictionary. So those would have been, I think, better. Syntax-wise, it would be nice to get rid of the parentheses around expressions in if and while and so forth. Like in Golang, you just say if some expression in an open brace, and that just gets rid of some of the clutter on your screen. I did a version of PowerShell at one point that had that, and it worked okay as long as it was right. The problem is when you got an error, like while x is greater than 3 open brace. Well, it looks at the open brace as the beginning of a script block rather than the beginning of a statement in that case. So you can get some really screwy errors. What else? Yeah, workflow. I would totally not do that again. It just never came together. It had some interesting capabilities, being able to survive reboots and things like that, but the overhead to make that happen made everything really slow. So I think we would have been better off having some kind of syntax like DSC, where you have islands of functionality enclosed in a larger wrapper. So.
Okay, great. So we are.
Oh, and the other thing that
okay.
I would do is make the parameter binder. We still should do it. Is make the parameter binder faster. PowerShell is quite slow, and a lot of that is because of the complexity of figuring out how to bind the parameters for a command. It's this little engine that runs all the binds in parallel and uses bitmaps to track which parameter sets are still allowed. That's, by the way, is why there's a limit on 32 parameter sets. It's the size of an int. So it uses a bitmap. And so you can't have more than 32 parameter sets in a command.
Okay. Oh, Alexander had another question. Let me just show that to you. If the PowerShell remoting over SSH is the future, shouldn't SSH replace remoting be enabled by default with PowerShell 7?
Well, PowerShell 7 doesn't ship with the OS, right? And so it isn't there by default unless you install it. So when you install it, you have to configure it. And you also have to have SSHD running and things like that. So since PowerShell is not a Windows component anymore, then I don't think that this is practical to do.
Okay. So, Markus, we have
next question. How did your past experience with other language-related projects influence your work on PowerShell?
Oh, a ton, a huge amount. Before I worked at the company doing Interix, which was a POSIX subsystem for Windows, and had all the Unity stuff. Before that, I worked for a company called MKS that did the MKS toolkit was a set of Unix utilities written for Windows, or written for DOS originally, I guess. And so I used to maintain the make program, awk, and some of the language components in the MKS toolkit. So when it came time to do a shell, I had a bunch of experience with shell type languages, but I'm also very interested in programming languages. So I spent a lot of time looking at different languages, and we wanted to adapt or adopt some of the best features from other programming languages, like splatting. Splatting is really important in PowerShell. The ability to pass a collection as the parameters makes command calling command possible. It makes, I see almost a standard use of PowerShell where you define all the parameters in an array and then add that, splat that array into the command on the next line. Just because because of the way the line continuations work, it's easier doing it that way with braces rather than using the backtick. So splatting was one. We were considering the way the -and works. We were considering Python's mechanism where it returns the last value in an AND expression. So A and B. If A is true and B is true, then it returns the value of B, which may not be a Boolean, it might be an integer. So that is a way of doing conditional access. We did, in fact, add the ternary operator, the condition question mark, option 1, colon, option 2, which I wasn't particularly fond of. I mean, I use it, but it's considered to be a confusing piece of syntax in other languages that have it. Like Rust, for example, doesn't have it. You can, like in PowerShell, you can assign the output of an if statement to a variable. So there's no need to add this extra syntactic bit. But that's my opinion. That's other people had different opinions.
Yeah. Okay. I remember. I just read. I think a comment a few days ago about especially this area where I think it was I don't know who it was who said I could use it, but I rather not doing it because it becomes more difficult to understand the code if I'm working with that.
Yeah, especially if you have like nested instances of it.
Yeah. So,
and then you have to add parens and all that kind of stuff. So it can lead to hard to figure out code.
Yeah. Okay, so I would sneak in the second question that we got here from Doug, because I think it's kind of the segue to what we wanted to talk as well. Now we talked about the past. Mm-hmm. In the past 5 years, what concepts or practices have you found it necessary to unlearn in order to continue advancing in the rapidly evolving field of software development?
There are things that we learned long ago, like structured programming, that are not necessarily followed now. They're slightly different. So there's I don't think I had to unlearn a lot of stuff, but there's always lots of new stuff to learn, like microservices and all that, like the CQRS and domain-driven design and all that kind of stuff. That are new sort of practices, agile, like Scrum and design patterns. Design patterns were a big thing for object-oriented languages. So I don't think that I had to unlearn a lot. But if you don't like learning, don't be a software person.
Very true. So okay, we have one more question regarding PowerShell from Alexander. So I think we can get this in here as well.
So I mentioned that we had looked at Perl as a sort of a source language. So there's a couple of things from Perl. Very few things from Perl that are still in PowerShell. The use of the @ symbol for collections. Perl had different sigils for different data types. So if you put a $, then it was a scalar data type, and an @ sign was an array data type. So we used @ as a symbol for splatting and other array operations. It's not a precursor, but it's just a common notation. And then $_ is another Perl-ism as the default variable. And the reason $_ is the value in the pipe is that it looks like a pipe fell over, right? So if you think the pipe symbol is an up and down arrow, if that fell over, then it would look like an underbar. So that's kind of the previous objects fall into the underbar of the next stage.
Okay, so I would say
I missed the other part of his question. $PS item. $underbar is actually hard to explain to people. They kind of like it seems weird. Punctuation seems weird. So we decided that we would we got a lot of feedback that it was hard for users to understand $underbar. So we thought, well, we'll give it a different name. And we spent probably months discussing the name so that people could write something that was more easily understood. And the name that we came up with was item. So for each item in the pipeline. But because we already had if it was a standard variable, it would collide if somebody else had a $item variable. So we had to give it the PS prefix, and so it's $PS item. In retrospect, I think we should have done what Kotlin did. Which Kotlin is the language on the JVM. They have an implicit pipeline parameter, which is called it. So you say it would be $it instead of $PS item, which is shorter, but I think it's equally mnemonic. But anyway, nobody ever uses it.
Yeah, that's what's
$1 is just easier to type.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So yeah, so I think now it's time for Braid, I would say. So we have one short question, right, Markus?
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Why Braid?
Why Braid? What is it?
So I mentioned earlier that the PowerShell is two pieces: the language and the pipeline. So Braid is a kind of a replacement for the language component, where I can try out new ideas. And like a lot of ideas from functional programming are coming into pretty much all programming languages. So pattern matching is a big one. The ability to do pattern matching and destructuring objects. C# has added, little by little, has been adding a lot of pattern matching. And I think that PowerShell could probably benefit from it. But I wanted to have a framework where I could try my ideas very easily. So rather than having to modify PowerShell to do things like that, I just chose to do a separate language. A Lisp-based language. So it's the default syntax in PowerShell is command, argument, argument, argument. If one of those arguments also has to call a command, then you put it in parentheses, and so on. And so that's what Braid syntax is it's command, argument, 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 and nested commands are in parens. Whatever it's a extremely simple language from the perspective of it doesn't have control structures, it has functions. So the if function for doing the equivalent of an if statement is done through a function in Braid that can be replaced or augmented or changed. While is the same way.
I think it would be cool if you maybe could show a few examples.
Sure.
Show me. I think I have. Is this? Yeah, here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting.
So this is a Braid session. It prints out a bunch of statistics, so I know if I'm making things worse. But just basic functionality. Right. So this is a very command line experience in Braid. This is Braid, and again, it's just a list of functions that pipe into the next function, that pipes into the next function. So and they can be PowerShell functions, or they can be Braid functions. LS is just an alias for the get child item command, just like it is on Windows. But the sort command is a built-in Braid function. It has a descending parameter, the same as the sort object does. But there's a few differences. Map is the mathematical name for the select operation, and takes 3 items. And you can see there's little syntactic differences. In the shell, a word that doesn't start with a $sign is considered to be a string, and otherwise it's a variable. Braid reverses that. So if it just sees an undecorated string, it assumes that's a variable and tries to retrieve the value. If you want to suppress that, you put a single tick in front of that variable, and it'll be passed as a string. Likewise, sort descending dot length. Dot length is the property on a file system object. So it treats methods and properties like functions as well. And again, using map just maps the .name property request across all the objects that are being passed in, and then take 3. So it's like select object dash first 3, except it's much shorter. So.
And I think also if I remember correctly, your session you gave at the PSConf EU, you talked about the performance differences between
yes.
PowerShell and Braid, right?
Mm-hmm. So this is the Fibonacci. Oh, I might as well show them. So that's the Fibonacci sequence in Braid using pattern matching. Talk a little bit more about that in a minute, and then. That's the equivalent PowerShell function. And now let's time them. For the Braid function. For a while.
Yeah.
It's time to go get a coffee while this is running.
This is a big difference. Yeah,
it's a big difference. Yeah, I think it's 10 times faster. The Braid equivalent, even doing things like wait a little longer. I'll switch it out for the Braid equivalent. ID is a function that takes its argument and returns the argument.
Mm-hmm.
So again, 10 times faster.
Okay. Wow.
Oh, sorry, my mistake. It's actually almost 100 times faster in this particular example.
Okay.
So, yeah, the performance was not a goal for Braid, but Braid uses much simpler function dispatch. And if you don't use any commands in PowerShell, then the compiled PowerShell is slightly faster than Braid, but you can't do anything without using commands. So you have to use commands, and that's why I mentioned earlier that we should have invested more in the performance of the parameter binder. I think that there's still room to do that, but it shouldn't be this much different, especially since I didn't do anything to make Braid fast. I just implemented stuff, but it ended up being a lot faster.
And what do you say, like let's say the target audience, so to speak? So what do you see people start using it? I mean, obviously you started it because I think you mentioned it because it was fun for you to do it. But I guess you see people starting using it, or also contributing to the project that is on GitHub, or
no? So far, James Brundage is the only one who's contributed to the project, yeah, I still need to do the out of the box experience in Braid right now is not great. It doesn't have very good tab completion. The help system doesn't work very well, so I need to fix those things before people can really adopt it. But I would consider it to be a shift left language. So in the DevOps spectrum, PowerShell kind of sits right in the middle, and Braid would shift more towards the developer side of things.
Okay.
Because it's more. One of the things that I also wanted to do with Braid is make it a better programming language. There's a number of things in PowerShell, some of the implicit conversions, and especially the automatic conversion of an array of one element into a scalar when going through the pipeline that makes certain types of programming really tricky. You get these really weird errors that are difficult to debug. So I wanted to make braid more strict about a bunch of stuff. So an unnamed variable causes an error instead of returning returning a value. If like for example, returns an error. In PowerShell, it would have happily, it's returning an error because there are two types of objects in the pipeline. There are directory info objects and file info objects. And directory info objects don't have a .length property on it. And so when Braid sees a property that doesn't exist on the target object, it generates an error. You can still get the PowerShell behavior by qualifying it with a question mark at the end. Oh.
Okay.
Sorry. So now you can see the nils, those are the directories. So this is a way of saying, if you see if the property is there, then give me the property, otherwise return nil or null. So you can selectively allow islands of flakiness in your program, but it's strict by default. Types are also, so a type literal is that. On PowerShell, if I pass it a string that looks like an integer, it would simply convert it. By default, type constraints in Braid don't do that. So if you want to have a function that has very strictly typed arguments, then you can do that in Braid. You can't currently do that in PowerShell. If I do want to have the implicit conversions done, then I can do that, and it'll turn it into an integer. So that kind of thing is something that I wanted to experiment with. How much better would it be for programmers if the system was more strict? And I think it's pretty good. Some of these things, like we could, for example, on the type constraints in PowerShell, we could say if you did square bracket, exclamation point, type name, close square bracket, so put an exclamation point in the type literal, then you could do the strict typing. It would be loose by default, but you could make a strict declaration without introducing a breaking change into the language. So that might be worth doing to improve the programmer's experience. And that was, I mean, one of the motivators for Braid was to look at these new language features and see how they would work in a shell type environment. PowerShell hasn't, like the last significant language change to PowerShell was adding the ternary operator. Very little, the language had changed very little since classes were invoked. Implemented there, that's the word I'm looking for. So there's a lot of ideas, new ideas that, like pattern matching and so on, that we could adopt for PowerShell. I think the switch statement could be changed in a fairly seamless way to handle pattern matching. And just sort of, I showed the. So this is a pattern function that takes a single argument. If the argument is 0, then it returns 1. If the argument is 1, then it returns 1. Otherwise, if it's a number, then it calls this computation to calculate the next number in the sequence. And that's, I think it's very clear. It's an interesting way to reason about your code. It can also be used as a match function as well. So PowerShell, So Braid, as I said, Braid, everything in Braid is a function. There aren't any keywords. There aren't any operators. Everything is the same. Everything is a function. So the plus sign is a function. Like addition is a function. So I'm going to do +1, 2. Because it's a var-arged function, I can make it, sum up an arbitrary number.
Mhm.
So it's a little weird writing expressions, but it gives you certain other advantages. For example, so PowerShell has for each, which is equivalent to map, and it has where, which is equivalent to filter, but it doesn't have reduce. Reduce, or also called fold left, is a function that takes its arguments and sort of folds them back on top of each other using an operator to combine them. So for every item in the list, it takes the sum of the previous items and adds it to the current item. So it just lets me add up a whole collection of values. If I change it to use a multiply sign, then this is the factorial 100. And it's fast enough that you can go from pretty large numbers. So I took like 141 milliseconds to compute Fibonacci of 10,000. It's a little hard in the garbage collector, as you can see. But so being able to use operators, having operators be functions means that I can pass the operator into a higher order function.
Okay, we have another question from Alexander. This kind of relates to PowerShell and Braid. And another topic that, of course, is interesting. How can AI make PowerShell users more productive? Do you use it when you work with PowerShell or develop Braid?
I haven't used it a lot. I mean, that's what Doug Fink and I are working on a project for my publisher, Manning, around PowerShell and AI. So I'm definitely playing with it, but I haven't used it to generate. Well, that's not quite true. I use it to generate the code to access ChatGPT. So I asked ChatGPT, how would I access your services? How would I use your API through PowerShell? And it gave me a PowerShell script that I then tweaked a little bit to make it work.
Okay. So basically the answer is yes, you're using it. And so yeah, that was one of the things that we wanted to also ask you at the kind of the end of the session, because I heard from Doug that you and Doug are in the process of publishing something maybe around PowerShell and ChatGPT. So that will be very interesting, I think, for people.
Yeah, I think so.
So it's definitely worth following you. I put in the links of your Twitter handle, LinkedIn account, and your GitHub repo already in the chat.
Cool.
So yeah, I think we are already a little bit over time, 1 hour, but it was really fascinating to
run one last
see that. Yeah, please go ahead.
The burn console was an example that Lee Holmes wrote in PowerShell quite a while ago, and I adapted it to Braid. It actually uses add type to build some code, so it can run fast. But it's a cool demo. It gives you little flames. So
okay.
Yeah, I have lots of GUI demos, but they won't work because the screen projection is not working.
Okay, but is this something that people can find in your GitHub repo as well as examples? Okay.
Yeah, in the Braid depot, I have a whole bunch of examples, some of which like.
The famous thing. Yeah. This is one of the things that when I started with PowerShell, I found that at one point with PowerShell, I found that that's great fun stuff, right?
Yeah. And this is an OpenAI function. Let me bring it up in them. So this is a Braid function that queries ChatGPT. And so here's the JSON payload, which is exactly JSON, except it's also RAID. RAID's syntax is a superset of JSON, basically, with parentheses. And so you define that payload and then just call invoke method, setting the headers.
Okay.
Yeah, so here it sets up the headers, and then just uses invoke rest method, and then gets traces back. So it's very, very simple to do this kind of thing.
Cool stuff. So yeah, so as I said, I think people should take a look at your repo. And yeah, I think it was really it's fascinating. And is there any final thing you would like to mention about Braid or?
It's tail recursive with explicit tail recursion, which means almost nothing to most people. But I got early on when we started showing PowerShell, people were asking if it was tail recursive. That is tail call optimization, where the last thing that you call in your function is the same as the function, but you don't return from it. Then it can turn that, instead of being a function call, it can be turned into a loop. And so Braid does that. So you can write things that recurse forever.
Okay.
I think it's cool.
All right. So yeah, cool stuff. So again, thanks a lot for joining us. Thanks a lot for the people who followed the session and all the interaction. That was really cool. I think this was the most interactive one we had so far, Markus. All right. So I think
I think so too, but the one with Steve Lee, I guess, was also very interactive.
Yeah. But this one, I mean, it was, and the topic and the thing, hearing about the history was really awesome, and also how now you involve doing something new on top of PowerShell, and I think that's really cool. So again, thanks a lot for sharing all the information, and again, thanks for everyone who joined, and have a great evening, great afternoon, wherever you are on the world, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.